Morning. Our sermon text today is taken from the Gospel, Mark chapter 12, verses 38 to 44. Jesus denounces the scribes. As he taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive greater condemnation." The widow's offering. He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." The word of the Lord. Jesus is in the temple, and he's teaching in and around the temple building. Outside the main temple complex were several courtyards where groups of people could gather. There was a women's courtyard, one for men, and also another one for Gentiles. The crowds in the courtyard that day were very large. They were excited and were eagerly listening to the things that Jesus was saying. While he was teaching, Jesus fired off a warning about the behavior of the scribes. The scribes were the teachers of the Jewish law. He said, "Beware of the scribes, watch out for them." And he starts by labeling them as ostentatious, full of self-importance. They like to parade around in long, fancy, decorative robes. They strive to get the best seats at public events, to be in the front row at the synagogue where all can see them, sitting at the head table at banquets near the host or the honored guest, so that they appear that they themselves are being honored. These scribes, in their fancy trappings and preening in seats of honor, are grasping for praise and respect, very often completely unmerited. And then Jesus lays down his most stinging indictment of all. These scribes sometimes cheat widows out of their belongings, their homes, and their money. These men are ripping them off. Now let's remember that back in that time, men dominated society. They handled all the property and the assets of a household. When women lost their husbands to death, they could be really vulnerable economically. Widows are often used in the Bible as a metaphor for weak or needy, unprotected persons. The scribes, most of whom were not paid a salary, depended on money from patrons for their living, and as religious leaders would often step in to help widows manage their financial affairs on the premise of offering prayerful solace and protection. Jesus warns that such behavior can create situations ripe for abuse, and that unscrupulous actions like this will result in severe punishment, even damnation for the perpetrators. These men will get theirs in the end. Then in verse 41, Jesus moves over to the collection box of the temple to observe the place where people present their offerings to the treasury. He watched members of the crowd making their monetary donations. And at that time, those offerings were a very visible and public act for people. Many of the rich folks gave great sums of money. And then a poor widow steps up and puts in 2 coins, coins variably called pennies or mites or coppers, worth very little. This prompts Jesus to summon his disciples and observe, the rich gave what they didn't need, what they'll never miss, but the poor widow gave all she had, all the money she had to live on. So in these 2 somewhat unrelated adjacent segments of Mark's gospel, first Jesus denounces scribes, and then second praises a poor widow's offering of all she has. But these 2 passages to me are intertwined, and they say a lot when you take them together. I think the stars of the show here are the widows. They are the key players in a 2-act story of greed versus generosity that has a kicker to it as well. So as the curtain rises in Act 1, the audience oohs and ahs at the ornate flowing finery worn by the scribes. Some of them looked almost like those chiseled, handsome pilots in the old war movies with their silk scarves blowing in the breeze. These teachers of the law, however, according to Jesus, are not to be trusted. Like vultures, they may prey on grieving widows, stepping in with fervent, long prayers on their lips while they eyeball the widow's money and her assets that just might be ripe for the taking. In this case, Jesus warns that a man, even a man of the cloth, can swoop down and steal from a woman in such a situation. Despicable, really despicable behavior. And Jesus assures that such actions will result in condemnation, in punishment. Here, Jesus invokes justice. Another widow is the central figure in Act 2. This one is not moneyed, not holding estate assets. No, she is poor and has next to nothing. Yet she gives all the money she has to the temple coffers. Her gift is almost nothing compared to the opulent sums of the wealthy. But Jesus focuses his disciples on this act of the widow emptying her pocket, even to the potential detriment of her well-being. He says that she has put in more than anyone. Yes, she can be seen as almost saint-like in her generosity, and her devotion in poverty versus the converse by the wealthy illustrates the point of who is truly the more admirable. But I believe that Jesus was teaching us something more here, beyond what we observed on stage in Act 1 and Act 2. Let's recall that the wealth and the trappings and the opulence of the temple were things that Jesus hated and condemned. And here in this story, a poor woman may have felt compelled to give her last coins to the Lord, risking her livelihood. Why would the temple allow this? Why would the temple elders allow one of its believers to suffer? Does the temple simply not care? Does legislative stewardship override mercy? In my eyes, here, Jesus invokes mercy. So in summary, yes, Jesus warned his disciples against trusting potentially unscrupulous men in positions of authority. And he raised to them the observation that a needy woman could have been pressured by the church leaders, men, to fork over all she had despite her abject poverty. In both of these scenarios, men, those in positions of control, are doing harm to women. Jesus condemns this back in 32 AD. What is he saying to us in 2015? Who are wearing the flowing fancy robes in our society today? Top elected officials? Large corporate CEOs? Professional sports icons and pop music idols making mega-million-dollar paychecks? Cable TV hucksters? 0.1%ers? Jesus is warning me against any of these and others who would take advantage of powerless persons or who would disadvantage any child of God in real need. Jesus warns me against gender bias, against speaking ill of, against inequality, and against acting indifferently or apathetically where an issue of need is before us. National politics often become an arena where biases of many types in the name of changes to policy are played out right in front of us. We often find out which candidates would fight for altruistic causes, which can help those with less, those without power. And also those other candidates who decry the cost of making policy changes, especially those that would help them. Jesus reminds me to love God and love my neighbors above all, even when I observe a fray of politics. Jesus reminds me that mercy and justice are hallmarks of the Wesleyan Methodist tradition. Brothers and sisters, what is Christ saying to you in 2015? What is he saying to you about equality and charity? Are you listening for his personal message to you when you pray? What will be on your heart when you meet the poor widow?